Okay, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world right now. Welcome to this RightCrowd webinar. My name is Bart Vansevenant. Just very practically, this webinar is in listen-only mode. So as I walk through the content, do not hesitate to file questions in the chat window, which you should be able to see. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll look at the questions that have been filed and I'll address those. So welcome. In the next 20 minutes, what we'll do is we'll talk about what we believe is the weakest link in physical security today. And as you may have guessed from the title we have up on the slide here, we're not convinced that people are those weakest link. So apart from looking at what that weakest link then is, we'll also be introducing as part of the presentation a new concept in physical security. So stay tuned for that. Now, before we dive into the content itself, very briefly about who we are. RightCrowd is an Australian-based vendor of security products. More specifically, we develop products that help manage the access and presence of people, and we do that to help create safe, secure, and compliant workplaces. The goal of this presentation is not to give you a product overview. This is not a commercial presentation about RightCrowd. But of course, if you would be interested to find out more about what exactly we do, what the products do, we'd be happy to follow up with you and give you such an overview. Let's dive right in. Physical security has been something that humans have dealt with throughout history. It's a very old concept, and it started based on the need to protect our physical integrity, to protect the assets that we possess, etc. And given that it has a long history, there have been a couple of implicit assumptions that we have been making. And what I want to do before we dive into that weakest link is highlight some of those assumptions that we make every single day, not always consciously, but they are at the basis of everything we do in physical security. The first assumption that we make is that we can only achieve physical security by building hard perimeters. We've been used to that. If you look back in history, Roman times, medieval times, we're used to building big walls, doors, gates, etc. And we think that that is the only and the best way to protect ourselves from a physical perspective. Second assumption we have been making is that we cannot trust people. And that is why a lot of people in the security space believe that humans are the weakest link, because it's at the end of the day, if something happens, it's very often a bad actor that causes what happened. So we think that humans are the weakest link. So that's the second assumption we make, and that's very important. If you look at the security controls we put in place, a lot of them are based on this assumption. And then the third assumption we have been making is that technology is what we need. Technology is going to fix everything. Technology is going to make it better. And of course, technology has evolved tremendously. In the medieval times, technology might have been the first version of a lock. Today, that is something much more advanced from a technology perspective. But still, we look for tools, for controls to help us protect the organizations. And if I would ask the audience here, like, do you believe that we're doing a good job in physical security, and more specifically in physical access control? I believe that the majority of you would say, well, yes, we're doing a fairly good job. We have been putting in place a lot of physical security measures over the last decades. We have our access control, we have our video cameras, we have intrusion detection and the like. And yes, we think that we're doing a good job. Now, to illustrate that that is not necessarily always the case, I just want to throw out a couple of anecdotes, and all of those are real-life examples, organizations that I've been involved with in one or another way, and I just wanted to share them to illustrate that while we have all of this great technology, while we have been basing ourselves on these assumptions, that in reality things are far from great today. I'm not going to name the organizations for privacy reasons, but each of them are actual cases that we've come across. The first one is about a large international airport. And in an audit that didn't take place that long ago, as part of the physical access control review, they found out that they had, and I'm not kidding, 300,000 access cards that were still working, that were still configured in the physical access control system, but they belonged to people, either employees or contractors, that were no longer working for this organization. So pretty amazing. You put in place all of this great technology, but then from a process perspective, you miss the fact that so many people were no longer working with the organization and still had access. And of course, you don't control what happens with those cards. So who knows who has those cards and who has been misusing them at some point. Second one is an organization where, as part of a review we did, we found out, or we noticed, that in the system, in the access control system they have, that there are more access levels than actual employees in the company. And you may ask yourself, like, how on earth can that happen? Like, you never create as many access levels as you have employees. And of course, if you set up an access control system, you indeed would not do that. But what happened is something that happened in a lot of organizations. There's history. The access control system was put in place a couple of decades ago, first version, and then a physical security manager starts, fits out, sets up the system, and then that person leaves, someone else comes in, and then the organization changes, and new leaders ask for like new types of access levels and new controls, and the system grows and grows and grows, and at the end of the day, you end up with the situation. There's so many access levels in the system that no one really knows which is still used, which is still valid, far from an ideal situation, as I'm sure you'll agree. And then the third anecdote is my absolute favorite one. This is about a Belgian bank. We had a new corporate security officer that came into the bank a couple of years ago, and as part of his new role, one of the first things he did is he hired an external agency and asked them to do a physical penetration test at the bank. And the agreement with this organization was to try to get into the organization and do a couple of things. And they agreed on 10 specific scenarios. And to give you a few examples, one of the scenarios was trying to get onto the trading floor with a piece of equipment. Another example was try to get into the office of one of the executives of the bank and get one of the stamps that they have on their desk and put this stamp on this piece of paper. There was another one where they asked to try to get something, a piece of paper, a file, out of the finance department. And of course, just to be clear, this was a wide form of physical penetration testing, so pre-agreed with the bank, between the bank and the organization. And they got 1 month to try to achieve or go through the different scenarios. Now, to the complete surprise, even of the corporate security officer, let alone the rest of the executive team of the bank, this company succeeded in all 10 of the scenarios. So they were able to just deliver on all of these things. So despite the fact that this company is a highly secured environment, they have all of the controls that you can think of in terms of physical access control, they still were vulnerable to all of these relatively straightforward scenarios. And that leads me to the conclusion that if you look at what truly is the weakest link in physical security today, that it is very often our unconditional trust in technology, which creates a false sense of security. We think we're doing a great way. And to be clear, I'm not blaming the technology here, but I'm blaming the how we use and how we implement the technology. And that, to me, really is the weakest link in security today. So what I want to do in the next few slides is go into what can we learn from this? Like, what should we do to avoid these things from happening in your organization or in your customers' organizations? So where do we go from here? There's two important lessons I think we can learn from that, and I'll walk through both of them separately. For the first one, what I want to do is first take a sidestep, have a look at the sister domain of cybersecurity. Myself, I spent more than 15 years in the cybersecurity side, and interestingly enough, there's quite a few parallels between what has happened in cybersecurity and what I believe should happen on the physical security side of things. And if I look at what did happen in the cybersecurity space, if you look at the time period between 1995 and 2010, a lot of new technology was developed by vendors in the cybersecurity space and put in place by organizations. And the focus of most of those technologies was around building strong perimeters, very similar to what we just covered from a physical security perspective. So building walls, but then virtual walls between what was at that time considered the bad internet, the outside internet, and the trusted internal network. And we all have heard the term firewall. Companies like Check Point grew in that period, and a lot of firewalls were put in place across organizations around the world. But if you look at what happened in the beginning of this century, and certainly around the time frame of 2008 to 2012, we started to see a lot of hackings. It started first with more automated things like viruses and worms, as it was called at the time, and then more real hacks started to happen. And the industry, customers and vendors alike, started to realize that that sole focus on protecting that perimeter, on thinking that the internal network could be trusted and that everything was about protecting from the bad outside world, that did not really solve the problems. And what happened then is that if you look at the new vendors and new technologies that came onto the market over the last decade in cybersecurity, you will see that a lot of it is much more fine-grained security controls. And there has been a true shift towards what I would call a more holistic, risk-based approach. In cybersecurity, they went back to what is it really that we're trying to protect? It's the databases that contain certain information, it's the applications that give access to that data, it's the endpoints that users are using. And so they started to move towards a much more balanced set of security controls. They're still protecting the connection out to the internet, but they've also put in place security controls around the different assets that they're trying to protect. And I believe that that is something that we should and that we will be doing in the physical security space very soon. And if we do that translation, like what does that mean when we apply it to physical security, it roughly looks like this. And this is where we would like to introduce a new term in the security space, which we call presence control. We're all familiar with perimeter control, the barriers we put around our organizations. And then, of course, we're all familiar with access control. It is that point-in-time decision where we validate, does this person have the authority to enter this part of the organization, the building, yes or no, grant or deny. What presence control is about, it's about a continuous validation to find out whether or not everyone on site is right, whether they have the authorization to be there at that point in time. So instead of a point-in-time decision, yes or no, and knowing that there are some ways to get around that access control, presence control takes that one step further and does that in a continuous way. What I'll do on the next slide is briefly touch on what presence control really is about, how it works, and then we'll move on to the second big lesson we can learn. But so first, presence control. The very first thing I want to highlight, and that's the beauty of presence control, is that it leverages the investments that organizations have done in access control. So we're not saying that access control is bad and that you should throw it away. No, access control did come with very good measures that were put in place. Access control comes with a centralized engine in which you manage your users, your identities, in which you manage who's allowed to access which parts of the building, zones, access levels, and the like. We'll leverage that in presence control. So we're not talking about changing those backend systems. We're not changing sort of the infrastructure that has been put in place for access control, like door controllers and readers, etc. All of these can be used also as part of presence control. But what we are changing is the credential, the piece that the user, whether it's an employee, a contractor, or a visitor, is using as he gets through the organization. In traditional access control, the credential is what we call a passive tag. It's very often a badge, piece of plastic that does nothing until it's held in front of a door reader, where it's then being read to find out like who is carrying this one. With presence control, we're going to replace that credential and move it from a passive credential to an active digital security credential. And that comes with so much more possibilities, which we'll go into in a second. And again, the beauty is if you look at how we can then move from a passive to an active credential, that there are ways to even leverage the investment you did. The wearable that you see on the screen here, the digital badge holder, which we developed at RightCrowd, allows you to simply insert your existing access card, and it turns that passive card that you had into an active digital security credential. And so with presence control, what now happens is that by changing the fact that the credential becomes digital and active, we will know, first of all, where people are inside of the building, and typically by zone. There's also the space of geolocalization where you try to do precise tracking of people. That's not so much the goal of presence control. Presence control is all about knowing what are the different zones that we have as an organization based on risk, and then do we know who's in that area at this point in time, and is that person allowed to be there, yes or no? So that's the first thing we achieve with presence control. We know where each person is inside of the building, zone by zone. And the second thing we achieve through presence control is that we know for sure who that person is and whether that person is authorized. And that is very different from the traditional access control space. If I walk around in an organization today with my access badge, the access badge from my organization, I walk around with a piece of plastic that has, in a lot of cases, the logo of the organization, a small picture, and my name. And people around me, if they look at me and watch at what I have, they look at the badge and they just assume that I'm allowed to be there. And what happens, and it's a human thing, we mix up the two concepts of authentication and authorization. The badge, the piece of plastic, is a form of authentication, but it does not tell me anything about authorization. Am I allowed to be here in this place, yes or no? And that again changes with presence control. With presence control, we have that continuous validation that we know that is indeed that person. And secondly, we know that that person is authorized to be there. And if you do this smartly from an implementation perspective, and that is what we have done with the wearable that you can see on the slide here, the digital badge holder, as we call it, we will also give a visual indication to people around you whether or not that person is authorized to be there. And what we do by doing all of this is addressing known weaknesses of the current access control implementations. And again, I want to highlight there's a lot of strong things in access control. We just make it even stronger by extending it into presence control. We are addressing things like tailgating. We are addressing a lot of forms of social engineering. If we go back to our example of the bank, a lot of what that outside company did in the penetration test was social engineering. They talked themselves into the organization. They were able to get to whatever part of the building they wanted to get to, and then they achieved what they needed to do. If you make it very explicit also visually whether or not a person is authenticated and authorized to be at that place, you significantly reduce that risk of tailgating and social engineering. And then one last very important point, presence control also opens up a large amount of new types of applications that go way beyond physical security. If you now know where people are zone by zone in your organization, and you know that you can count on the fact that that indeed is that person and whether or not the person is authorized to be there, you can think of many different applications. You can think of applications in the domain of safety, who's still in the building, which part of the building are they in. You can think of logical security. Why don't we use that same credential to get access to certain systems? You can think about convenience type of applications. Is the meeting room really occupied? How many people do we have in the cafeteria? As the executive walks up to the elevator, make sure the elevator is down even before he gets to the elevator. There's health type applications, a lot of building automation related applications. So we firmly believe that this industry will move from access control and take that next step, leveraging the investments we did, but extend it out to get towards presence control. So that's one important lesson we can learn if we looked at the anecdotes and what went wrong. By using the technology we have in a more smart way, we can get to that presence control sort of realization. And then the second thing I want to highlight, I think it's a very important lesson, is we should restore the balance between what is so often called people process technology. We really have that huge dependency on technology, but we missed out a lot on the people and the process side. And I want to start with the people side. Going back to the implicit assumptions we have made, we don't trust people. That's what we believe we should do in physical security. People cannot be trusted. Well, think of it. There's probably a very small percentage of people out there that are bad actors and are trying to do something bad. But if you reverse that, if you think of it from the other angle, that also means that well over 99% of the people can be trusted. So instead of distrusting everyone, why don't we engage the vast majority of people that we have in the organization to help find the bad actors, to help detect bad behavior? And that is, again, something we can do. Presence control will help a lot there. If you can literally visualize authorized presence, everyone in the organization can start contributing to protecting the organization. So that's, I think, one important thing to keep in mind. Let's start looking at people in a different way and engage them in security. And then the second thing in terms of restoring the balance is put more focus on the processes. If you go back to the two first anecdotes we covered, the fact that there were so many access cards out there that were still valid, but people were no longer with the organization. If we look at the fact that there were more access levels than people in the organization, that is not because the access control system was bad, had nothing to do with technology, but it was all about the processes. A lot of it today still is manual. We send an email, hey, can you add this person to that? Hey, can you add this new access level? And we start building up a system that becomes harder and harder to manage. What we need to do is make sure that we have clear policies and that we then make sure that those are enforced in a clean way. And in larger organizations, the only way to do that is by automating access rules, automating workflows so that it happens in a consistent way and not prone to human error or people intervening and making changes that deviate from the policy. So if we summarize, like in conclusion, and going back to the implicit assumptions we made, we started with saying physical security can only be achieved by building hard perimeters. Well, there's definitely still a need for hard perimeters, and most importantly, the outside of the organization. But with the new presence control solutions that are entering the market, we think that there is a possibility to start using a combination of these hard outer perimeters with less expensive and more flexible ways of protecting internal zones through that presence control. Maybe there are areas where you don't necessarily need to put very strict hard perimeters like locked locks and door controllers and the like. Maybe there are some areas where, for example, in an open space environment, you still want to make sure that you control who's entering those open space areas, but without necessarily investing a lot in physical perimeters. We still have our access control system in place, but by using perimeter presence control solutions, you can enforce them in a way that requires less infrastructure. Second one was people. We cannot trust them. I hope this helps you to sort of convince you that engaging people in security to help find the bad actors, to help spot potential incidents is something that makes a lot of sense. And then from a technical controls perspective, as I highlighted a couple of times, it's not that what we have right now is not working well. The controls themselves are not the issue, but it's how we use them. So ensuring the optimal use of the controls that are out there, and a lot of that related to automating your policies in the forms of rules and workflows, that will go a long way in optimizing the benefits of the investments we made in technology. I would like to thank you for the time, taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us for this webinar. And as I said at the beginning, if you would be interested to find out more about the actual sort of products and technology that we provide as RightCrowd, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can go either through our website or reach us at the email address that we have on the slide here. Thank you very much, and I wish you a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.